And from here, they began to think of solutions. In such situations, to survive, you have to start trying to invent things and tools that can help you. You don't have any other choice. They needed to start creating things. After a brainstorming session, they came up with the idea of using the sponge from the plane seats with the straps to make snowshoes. These shoes proved to be effective in walking on the snow, and their feet no longer sank easily. This invention was achieved after about a month from the beginning of this hardship. During this month, many of them began to see Nando as the leader because he had the strongest desire to survive. He was always the one who tried to motivate them and encourage them. In fact, he took on this role and began to act as a leader. On this day, after they tried the snowshoes and felt that they really worked, Nando, along with two of his friends, Roberto and Antonio, began a new exploration. They chose a day when the weather seemed clear and the sun was bright. Their plan was to try to move away from the plane as far as possible and return on the same day. It was like an experiment. They continued to walk and descended into the valley. After they climbed up a small hill, they saw the tail of the plane from afar. Of course, the tail had been thrown to a place after the crash. They went there to explore the inside and looked for any food they might find. All they found was a small piece of chocolate, but at least it was a change. From this, they got the camera that they would use to take the photos that would document their journey of survival in the mountains. From this, they also got 24-volt batteries that were attached to the tail of the plane, meaning they were part of the plane. At this point, the idea came to their minds that they remembered when they initially tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with anyone. They thought that maybe the battery was damaged in the radio, and that they could use these batteries to operate the plane's radio again. Don't confuse the plane's radio used for communication with the small radio that they had, which they used to listen to the news and radio stations. This is just for clarification. Nando and his friends, in order to get the tail, had to travel a longer distance than they had calculated. They felt that the time had passed, so they decided to spend the night in the tail of the plane. On the next morning, after the sun rose, they returned with their findings to their friends who were waiting for them at the front of the plane. After returning, the batteries were to be connected to the plane's radio. This person, Roy Harley, had some knowledge of radio equipment. He was not an expert, but he had some knowledge of these things. He was appointed as the radio expert for it, but the matter was complex, especially since they had no knowledge of these things. There were hundreds of wires and cables everywhere. How could they connect these wires to the battery and make the radio work? It was almost impossible without proper knowledge of these things. Unfortunately, despite their efforts and attempts regarding the radio, it didn't work for them, and this broke their spirits and made them feel more hopeless. Nando, despite his spirit being broken, tried to inspire them. He said to them, "As long as we are alive, we must not lose hope and continue to think of a way to survive." Nando, after having the idea that they should use the camera and document their journey of survival with pictures, said to them, "Even if we don't survive, maybe after several years or even 100 years, someone will find the wreckage of the plane and find these pictures, and they will know that we were alive." The days and weeks passed, and it had been approximately 2 months since the crash. Most of the remaining 19 were injured, and some of them were injured from the initial crash. The main thing was that it was getting worse with each day, and survival was becoming harder and harder for them. 3 of them died within this month, reducing the number of survivors from 19 to 16. That is, from the 45 who were on the plane, 16 remained, but most of the corpses that had died were already eaten by the living, and only a few corpses remained. Among these remaining corpses were Nando's mother and middle of a vast ocean, and the plane structure was like a small boat that protected them from the ocean. Leaving the boat was something terrifying. This was the thing that prevented them from moving from their place, afraid that any attempt to move away from this place would result in certain death. However, after more than 2 months without any new signs of hope, the only option was to move from their place. Of course, everyone was afraid of this. It was like throwing yourself into the ocean. You don't know where the idea is. The only idea they had was that they were currently on the western side of the Andes, because if you remember, before the co-pilot died, he told them that they had passed the city of Coricancha, which was in the western side, in the Chilean side. They thought they were in this area, but in reality they were closer to the eastern side. They had always had in their minds that if they moved from this place, they should head west because it was closer to civilization than cities, although in reality, the east was closer, and on the western side, there was a high mountain in front of them, while on the east, there was a valley. Going down the valley was easier than climbing the mountain. But they thought that if they headed east, they would encounter higher and steeper mountains, and the only thing that could block them was a river. This river was indeed difficult to cross, but if they reached the river nearby, they would probably be able to call for help from the people on the other side. Heading east was, on average, the best option for them. The road was still difficult and long, but if they had known all this information, it would have been the best option for them, without a doubt. But because they thought they were on the western side, they were always convinced that if they moved from this place, they would head west, which was their best option. Nando was determined to leave this place at any cost, but the rest of the group were hesitant and afraid. Every time Nando tried to convince them, their response was that this was not the right time, the weather was not suitable, and they should wait a little. It was clear that fear had taken over them. Nando knew that he couldn't leave alone, so he kept trying to convince them, or rather, to convince some of them that they should go with him. Most of them supported him, saying that he should go and try to find salvation, but they were not ready to go with him. Each of them said to him, "Yes, I agree with you, but I can't." They supported him, but no one volunteered to take the risk with him. Even Roberto, the closest friend of Nando, was hesitant. This was the closest friend of Nando, and he was the one who went with him when they found the tail of the plane. After Nando kept pressing him, Roberto finally agreed. The third person who convinced Nando to go with him was Antonio. The same thing was true for him. He was the third person who went with him when they found the tail of the plane. He was also the most athletic of them, so he was the natural choice for this journey. These three people who had gone with him to find the tail of the plane were the ones who would now embark on this journey for the new boat. This journey would be a one-way trip. Either they would reach safety or they would die on the way. Of course, at this point, they had to take all their preparations, and the rest of the group all helped, although they were afraid and hesitant. They all contributed as much as they could. The first thing, of course, was to allocate a larger portion of food for the three of them, which could last them for several days, even though the food was scarce. The second thing was that they would need a way to protect themselves from the cold night, because it was impossible to survive in the mountains without something to protect them. At this point, one of the group, whose name was Carletto, came up with the best idea. He collected insulating materials from inside the plane structure and used the electrical wires to make something similar to a sleeping bag. It was a large sleeping bag that could fit the three of them and was very durable. The others took turns sewing it, and the process of sewing took several days. After they prepared all the tools and basic items they had, the trio of Nando, Roberto, and Antonio said goodbye to their friends and set out on their difficult journey on December 12, 1972. The last words Nando said to Carletto biggest obstacle in front of them. They thought that once they reached its peak, they would be able to see the green valleys and cities or villages in the Chilean side. They knew that climbing this mountain would require them at least a whole day. They began to climb the mountain, and of course this was a very exhausting and difficult task. Due to the slope, this was a very difficult thing to do. In addition, they had no experience or previous experience in climbing mountains. Of course, at these altitudes, even breathing was difficult because the oxygen levels in the air were lower. The more they moved and exerted themselves, the more oxygen they needed. But due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became increasingly difficult. With every step they took, they constantly faced the danger of slipping. They tried to hold on, but they couldn't. Every step they took, they slipped down halfway. They tried to climb the rocky parts, which required great strength and fitness. The rocks even fell on them sometimes. The thing that helped them after they had lost a significant amount of weight, meaning one of them had lost about 30 or 40 kilograms. Finally, after all the effort they had put in, they reached what they thought was the peak. It was a fake peak, meaning a peak that appeared to be the top of the mountain from below. But when they reached it, they discovered that it was a fake peak, and that there was a higher peak ahead. They had to climb more to reach it. This shattered their morale. When they reached this fake peak, but at least the place was suitable for camping. They stayed huddled together and used the sleeping bag that their friends had made for them. Of course, the cold was extremely severe, but the sleeping bag allowed them to survive. On the next day, the three of them continued their arduous climb. Of course, their friends who were under the plane structure could see them as small dots from afar, but they were beyond their field of vision. After they climbed more on the mountain, Roberto noticed something that looked like a road or a path from a distance, but it was on the eastern side opposite to them. "This doesn't look like a road, does it?" He pointed to his friends and asked them, "This doesn't look like a road, does it?" Nando said that he couldn't see any road, and Antonio said the same. However, Roberto insisted that this was a road, and he even began to argue with Nando, saying that it would be better to descend from the mountain and head toward this road on the eastern side. "We've climbed all this distance to come back down, and that's it." However, Nando rejected this completely and said to him, "We've climbed all this distance to come back down, and that's it." This was the thing that Roberto saw, which was a road used by people, but it was on the eastern side, and they could have reached it if they had headed east, but at that moment, they thought they were closer to the west. They decided to continue their journey to the west and keep climbing the mountain. The climb was very exhausting and took much longer than they had thought they would need to reach the peak. Due to the fake peak and the difficulty of the path, it took them 3 days, but the hope that drove them was that they would see the green valleys and the cities and villages on the western side. This was always their hope, that when they reached the peak, they would see these things. However, the greatest shock came when they actually reached the peak and saw the snow-covered mountains extending in front of them on the horizon. There were no fields, no green valleys, no cities, no villages, and no signs of life. The feeling of despair they felt at that moment was indescribable. After all this effort and hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all the emotions of despair at that moment, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Nando, well, let's continue, and whatever happens, we'll either reach safety or die on the way. We will try." Roberto, although he was in complete despair at that moment, felt a spark of energy returning to him when he heard Nando speak this way. He said to him, "Roberto, Vo, you're right, my friend, we've come this far. Let's continue, and whatever happens, we'll either live together or die together." Nando then made the decision that since they were three, their movements were slow, and in addition, the food and supplies they had were decreasing significantly. Nando said to his third companion, Antonio, "You go back and give us the remaining food and supplies and return to the plane." He gave them the remaining food and supplies and went down the mountain. Of course, descending was much easier and faster, perhaps taking only a few hours. said to them that Nando and Roberto had taken the remaining food and supplies and decided to continue the journey on their own, and nothing would stop them except death. Nando and Roberto continued walking towards the west. They descended from the mountain they were on, but on the other side of the mountain, there was a road that extended between the mountains, and they decided that this road would be the one they would follow. The mountains around them were high, but fortunately they didn't have to climb any high mountains like the first one. The size of the area they were in made it difficult for them to feel the distance. They had no sense of the distance they had traveled or would travel, and this was a blessing in itself, because if they had known the distance, they might have felt despair. All that occupied their thoughts and minds at that time was moving forward. This definitely helped them psychologically, and their arduous journey between the mountains lasted for 10 days from the time they left their friends at the plain. However, after these 10 days, they reached the line that, for them, was the line of salvation, the line that ended in the snow and began in life. At this moment, it was like a new life for them. The happiness and joy they felt were impossible to describe. They began to walk in the green valleys they had dreamed of 10 days ago. Finally, they felt that they had truly returned to life. Even on their way, they saw a cow and began to say to themselves that surely there were people nearby. After all, they were in the wilderness and nature, and they hadn't seen any people yet, but they felt that they were close. They felt that they had reached the greenery, the grass, the flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto said that at this moment they felt like they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was nice, and there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt that these simple things, which we usually take for granted as normal in our daily lives, were the greatest things in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto traveled more than 60 kilometers, but they had not yet reached the place where they were now. Even after reaching the green valleys, they spent the last night in the open. On the next morning, they continued their journey and reached a river. The surprise was that a man riding a horse was present on the opposite bank. They began to shout at him and signal to him. The communication between them was difficult because the river separating them was large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. Of course, the man on the horse was surprised by the people on the mountains because, after all, they were above the mountains, and they had descended a long distance. Nando and Roberto didn't have a choice but to swim across the river because the water would carry them away due to its strength. The man on the opposite bank had an idea. He took a piece of paper and a pen, tied them to a stone, and threw them toward Nando and Roberto. Nando took the paper and pen, and all the while began to write a letter to him and explain their situation. Nando was a writer, and he wrote to him, "We came from a plane that crashed between the mountains. We are from Uruguay. We have been traveling for 10 days, and we are still in the plane structure, with 14 injured people waiting for rescue. We have no food or supplies and need help as soon as possible. Please help us. We can't even walk." Nando threw the letter to the man on the opposite bank, and the man, clearly showing signs of shock, read what was written. After reading it carefully twice or 3 times, he signaled to Nando with a gesture that he had understood the situation and signaled to them to stay in place and that he would come back to help. Before he left, he took a piece of bread and cheese and threw them toward Nando and Roberto. The bread and cheese were the first non-human meat food they had tasted in the past 2 months. The man on the horse took several hours to get the help as the place they were in was far from civilization and the cities. When the man managed to get the news to the authorities and the police, the journey took about 10 hours. Finally, the man returned with a group of soldiers and managed to rescue Nando and Roberto. They were found for the first time. Their condition was very pitiful. Their appearance showed was about to answer, but Nando interjected and said to the journalist that he would never answer this question. The two of them were literally coming out of hell. The authorities and the security forces tried to find out from Nando and Roberto the location of their friends. They gave them a map to try to determine their location. Nando had a good awareness of the location because during the 10 days they had walked between the mountains, he had always focused on the directions they were walking in, as he knew he had to remember the location to return to the others and rescue them. Nando pointed to the location he thought the plane was. The group said to him, "This location is in the Argentine side, on the eastern side of the mountains. It's impossible for you to have walked this entire distance." But Nando said, "I don't know if we are in Argentina or not, but I'm almost sure this is where the plane is." Of course, the distance they had walked, Nando and Roberto had walked between the mountains, was insane, about 60 kilometers. The authorities and the police couldn't believe how two weak and emaciated people could have walked this entire distance. They were skeptical about the location, but Nando kept insisting that this was the location. Of course, the remaining people at the plane had been waiting on their nerves for the past 10 days, and some of them had already lost hope and believed that Nando and Roberto had died on the way. However, at the same time, they were following the news on the radio, and you can't imagine their happiness when they heard on the radio that Nando and Roberto, two of the survivors from Flight 571, had been found. Their happiness was indescribable. They knew that they would finally be rescued. They sat down and hugged each other, and the joy of the whole world could not contain them. The authorities and the police summoned helicopters to start the rescue operation. The helicopter pilots asked Nando about the location, and Nando pointed to the same location on the map. But the pilot said to him, "Look, it's difficult for me to get them. I need you to come with me." Although Nando was certainly tired at that moment, he said, "Okay, I'll come." He boarded one of the helicopters and began to fly with them as they tried to track the route they came from. The good thing was that the weather on this day was relatively clear, but even so, flying at such high altitudes was difficult for the helicopters. The helicopter was shaking violently, and it almost crashed into the mountains again. Imagine the tragedy if it had happened. Finally, the helicopters passed the high mountain that was in front of them. This was the same mountain that Nando and Roberto had encountered. Nando kept pointing downward and saying that the plane structure was under them. The structure was white, and the whole world was white. It was almost impossible to see it. Even though the planes were close to the location at that moment, Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane structure or the remaining survivors until they landed at a very close height. Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane structure or the remaining survivors until they landed at a very close height. Finally, the helicopter landed at the location of the plane wreckage, and they finally saw the remaining group under them, and they were flying with joy. Finally, all 14 of Nando's friends who had remained at the wreckage were rescued. I am sure none of them will ever forget this day, which was December 22nd, 1972, the day of the rescue. The number of days they spent from the time the plane crashed until they were rescued was the same as the year of their birth, 72 days. The remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were brought to safety. Their condition was obviously very poor. Each of them had lost 30 to 40 kilograms from their weight, but their faces were filled with joy. After that, the news of their names was announced on the radio so that their families could know who had survived. After a short period, they met their families, and the reunion was rekindled. The news of this story spread and was covered by media around the world. Later, many articles in newspapers and magazines talked about their survival by eating the bodies of their companions. As this particular thing spread, and it was one of the reasons that attracted people to this story. One of the articles even began to talk against them and called them cannibals, causing a big debate among people. People began to discuss whether they would do the same if they were in their place. In the end, if they hadn't eaten story became one of the most famous stories of survival that spread around the world. Books were written about it, and many movies and documentaries were made about it. Nando and his friends appeared in many interviews and meetings and told their story in detail. This was one of the largest stories adopted by the media due to its strength and uniqueness, and possibly because of its happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years, and they held gatherings every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22nd. On this occasion, all the things we said about Nando in particular, who was the undisputed leader of the journey, were testified by his friends. They didn't say that he was the leader and that he saved them. They knew that the greatest credit for their survival was Nando's insistence on survival until the last moment, no matter what the circumstances. Nando, who was initially considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to the brain injury he had, and whose survival from this was something amazing in itself, and Nando and Roberto continued to communicate and meet with the man who rode the horse and helped them after they came down from the Andes. Their relationship with him remains strong and they are still friends to this day. In the end, it is impossible for one to understand the conditions that these people experience in these mountains. No matter how hard you try to imagine and put yourself in their place, you will never be able to understand their feelings and the psychological, emotional, physical condition they are in, unless you were actually in their place. I want to end with a question. If you were in their place, do you think you would be able to do what they did? Could you eat the flesh of your companions? And we have reached the end of the video, which is not subscribed to the channel, but you can subscribe and press the bell. And after that, you can watch some incredible stories. See you in the next video.